I remember when I was learning for the first time about the dynamics of systemic racism, how angry I was, because I was raised to be a good person oriented towards justice and peace. And when I realized that I too am embedded in patterns of racism and relationship and the way institutions function, and I can't do anything about it, I can't take myself out of the system, I was furious, because I was raised to be a faithful follower of Jesus and get things right. And to realize that I was complicit in systems that were keeping people down was so disheartening that I was grieving and angry. I think the challenge is to educate ourselves and educate each other, whether those are groups of white folks who are working together or multicultural groups working together, and to begin to ask, where are the places where I participate in systems that are excluding or oppressing? Where am I in circles that are only white just because they are? Where am I, where does my life touch up against these systems? And once you begin to see that, begin to ask the question, how can I participate with others, not alone, in dismantling those systems and building systems that will hold beloved community, that will hold the possibility of well-being and dignity for every person, and not just implicitly or explicitly cut people out.
The Jesus way,
oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
Is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way,
oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
Is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When He is King, all wars will cease. May His peace begin with me.
Over 40 years ago, M.R. Ziegler, an influential leader of the Church of the Brethren, brought together a group of people who wanted to renew and strengthen the historic peace witness of the Church of the Brethren. Hello, I'm Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. The historic meeting was held in the small town of New Windsor, Maryland, giving birth to the organization of On Earth Peace. Today, On Earth Peace is dedicated to developing leadership for peace in each generation. Today, we are fortunate to have with us the program director of Nonviolent Social Change for On Earth Peace, Matt Guynn of Portland, Oregon. Matt, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. The Nonviolent Social Change ministry of On Earth Peace is rooted in the philosophy and leadership of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Can you tell us about that?
Well, where I'd like to start is thinking about the way that Dr. King is seen by many in U.S. society at this point. He's seen as someone who was a charismatic leader who was able to work miracles in terms of the way he could speak and the way he could mobilize people. Dr. King was working from a philosophy, and he was working from a methodology. His philosophy and his methodology grew out of the influences that he drew on, like Gandhi and Tolstoy, and he was also actively influenced by all the people who were organizing around him. And so when we say that our approach is grounded in the philosophy and the methodology of Dr. King, we're talking about the leadership of an era, of the Black-led freedom movement, that didn't spring from nowhere, and that has lessons for us today that we can learn in terms of grounding ourselves in a philosophy that assists us to build a beloved community, a community that both those we like and love and those whom we detest and have a hard time getting along with are part of. The methodology that teaches us that working for peace is not just restraining ourselves from being involved in violence, but it's about active engagement in addressing the conditions that are underlying and causing violence that we experience around us in society today.
So there's an ongoing process of philosophy and methodology that has continued to evolve, and we're now in the time of Black Lives Matter and a few other things that are kind of socially acceptable or on the minds of certainly the people who are struggling with what's happening to them in their communities.
That's true. So the Kingian Nonviolence approach itself was codified after Dr. King was assassinated. In the years after that, folks who had worked with him were going around teaching what they'd learned from being active participants in the movement. Two of those, Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr., who was involved in the sit-in movements in Nashville as a college student and went on to be an ongoing leader in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and David Jensen, who's a little younger than Dr. Lafayette, who was a member of the Church of the Brethren, who joined Brethren Volunteer Service in 1962 and went to Chicago, where he got involved with the pre-organizing before the Chicago wing of the civil rights movement. And so the two of them, in the years after Dr. King's assassination, began to compare notes and then codified a curriculum approach that was a way for those of us who came after to grasp tools and approaches from that era to use in addressing our own challenges today. And that's called Kingian Nonviolence.
I was reflecting on what you said about being so angry.
Mm-hmm.
Who or what were you angry with?
To see a part of the world that I had not previously seen. I was angry because for a moment I myself felt like a victim, to realize I will always be perceived as a white person by people of color. I mean, I was naive,
undeniable,
right, and seen as someone who merits suspicion only because of my skin color. So, and I say just for a moment, because when I had that reaction and I was angry about it, then I realized, oh, this is what communities of color experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so it's just to acknowledge that we're all on a journey, and I was on mine. As someone who had learned about peace and social change when I was in school, I still hadn't gotten to the part of really understanding systemic racism. And you have to understand, this was also 25 years ago.
Well, but the reason I ask is because I think each of us has to really reconcile, particularly if we've come up in the privileged class.
Yeah.
We all have to for us to learn about these things, we have to experience some cognitive dissonance.
Right, that's what it is.
Yeah, we have to go
I'm a good person, but I'm embedded in systems that oppress people. What am I going to do about that?
And I'm part of that.
And I'm part of it.
Whether you like it or not.
Right. I think it's a particular challenge for people of faith because we're often raised to try and be good. And so these questions about social injustice that we are helping to perpetrate, even unintentionally, because we're in the systems and we're people who have skin privilege or class privilege, it can be very confusing because we're trying to be faithful and to follow God's call, but it's an additional opening to what faithfulness can mean. So there are many faces of who Jesus is. There's Jesus, the reconciler, who teaches us about going one to the other when we have problems with each other and working it out. And if that doesn't work out, taking other people with us. If that doesn't work out, taking it before the church. If that doesn't work out, starting all over again. And that's capped with teachings about forgiveness. That basically there's no end to the amount that we're called to forgive. So there's Jesus who teaches us that. There's also Jesus who disrupts the status quo, who turns over the table of the money changers in the temple. And so we live in a tension that if we're only choosing to follow one Jesus, we're missing other parts of Jesus. And this conversation about the different faces of Jesus and how we marshal ourselves collectively to follow Jesus who disrupts along with the other Jesus is one that we're actively engaged in the staff of our racial justice organizing ministry. So I give credit to Chibuso Petty, who I just heard speak last week about some of these themes.
I struggle with why are we still having to deal with this so many years later. And I was reading in the Honor of Peace mission that these things need to be retaught generationally. And we're in a new generation now of people who have, in some ways, taken things for granted, and in some ways, there's a whole new flavor of what people are struggling with, because we don't have black people sitting on the back of the bus, but we still have people who are being prejudiced against and who are not provided the opportunities that everyone else has, and that's kind of on a spectrum of many different levels of our social strata. But the Black Lives Matter has kind of come up recently because of the violence perpetrated by the people in authority.
Yes.
And a lot of times it's the police that are supposed to be protecting the communities who are perpetrating the violence.
Exactly.
And I think that's really a major problem. How do we deal with that when it's the police? Kind of reminds me of the Chicago riots. But what do you do when the police break the law?
Right.
Is Honor of Peace doing things with police and with communities to really struggle or clarify or work through the struggle of this kind of conflict?
In terms of active involvement, one of the members of the Honor of Peace community, whose name is Samuel Sarpia, is a pastor in Rockford, Illinois. And they have been developing over the last couple of years, training directly with police in this approach that's called Kingian Nonviolence. And so that's one example. Honor of Peace's organizing work in support of Black Lives Matter and what we call our racial justice organizing community of practice and resistance. So that's to say, we're building community among people who are agitated in these Black Lives Matter times and want to do something, whether or not they're already connected with the Black Lives Matter movement already. And so what we're doing is providing opportunities for online organizer clinics where people who are in their church congregation in Pennsylvania or Virginia or California or working in a community group here in Oregon can connect together on a monthly basis and talk about what it is to be an organizer, someone who provides loving support for others in order to catalyze change in our times in ways that we can actually see. We gather together on the web to provide loving accountability for one another, to set goals for our work in the coming month, and to talk about the craft of what it is to be a social change organizer.
This is a big deal to change to change our society in ways that everybody's included.
Yeah.
And everybody has an opportunity to be productive and fulfill their lives. It's really a big deal.
To change our society and all the institutions that we're a part of. So what we were talking about applies to our own individual congregations, our own faith communities. They apply to our traditions. I think to give it the benefit of the doubt, the Church of the Brethren didn't intentionally set out to be a majority white tradition. It just happened to be founded in Germany and never quite figured out how to move beyond its cultural specificity to authentically and deeply become a multicultural church. But the challenge before us today, as people who are involved in the Church of the Brethren, or whatever tradition that you're a part of, is to notice, where are we in terms of reflecting the society that's around us, in terms of ethnicity and the racial and cultural background of our participants. Is that where we want to be? What are the barriers within our traditions that we need to dismantle to make it possible to move towards becoming an authentically multicultural church and society? And so it's they're complex things, but they're also things that are worthy of rising to the challenge. And that's what I trust, is that the Spirit will always be with us in the challenges that we accept, in the challenges that we uncover. And sometimes it seems to me like our churches don't bite off challenges that are as big as we could handle. And so it's an opportunity.
We all have our comfort zones, and we kind of protect
Amen.
The fringes. One of the things that comes to mind when we talk about Black Lives Matter is Native American people who are not, their lives matter too, and they're not being recognized, I think, for some of the ongoing abuses and neglect that they're suffering. Is there any of that comes to your attention as a person in honor of peace?
So, of course, we're aware of the amazing resistance camp that's happening at Standing Rock. That's a resistance camp of thousands of Native Americans from around the continent who've gathered to try and stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. They're hunkering down for the winter. It's starting to get cold.
That access pipe, they're opposed to it because
it's going across sacred lands. It's proposed to go under a river. And their message is water is life, and we shouldn't jeopardize the water that we depend on. And so they're actually claiming the role of being water protectors. So in terms of active involvement, Honor with Peace has not been involved, although I'm watching the news every day. And we have some friends from here in Portland who have just been to the camp there as medical providers, or are just going to take equipment for the winter.
The reason I mention that is that those are people who are actually, like the peacemaker teams, they're actually putting themselves in line with what they feel is right and what they need to stand up for.
That's right.
And my sense is that corporate America, they want the pipeline. They really don't care. Corporations don't have feelings. You can't even put them in jail.
Right.
They just want the pipeline, and so they can make some money.
Right.
Regardless of anybody that gets trampled, or any part of nature that gets compromised or polluted.
Right. And so what you see is right now two incredibly active and dynamic liberation movements being led, one being led by Native Americans at Standing Rock, the other, the Black Lives Matter movement, both of which are lifting up possibilities for who we can be and how we can relate to each other as humans and in the natural world. So this is amazing leadership that's cutting through the status quo. And I think that it's up to those of us who come from communities that have relatively more privilege or are protected from those oppressions to ask ourselves, what are we going to do to stand in solidarity with the camp at Standing Rock? What are we going to do to stand in solidarity with the rivers in this country? What are we going to do to dismantle racism in our own institutions in solidarity with what's happening with the Black Lives Matter? What we're looking forward to is that the movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of many organizations that are providing leadership in the Black Lives Matter organizing and political program, have released a vision for Black lives that breaks down 6 pillars of the political program and vision for how society could be different that's woven into the movement for Black lives. And so we're working now to provide opportunities for people who are in our constituency to engage that vision for Black lives. Alongside that, there's a national series of boycotts that will be kicked off in early December on the anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. That's called the Injustice Boycott. The public leader of that process is a Black journalist named Shaun King. They, in early December, will be releasing boycott, calls for boycott that are aimed at different cities and states and other levels of government, with the goal to provide opportunities for masses of people to be involved in actually agitating for change around police brutality and other places where equity doesn't exist between the Black community and white communities. And so what we're talking about is, with something like those book groups, raising awareness and inviting churches to be in conversation with each other about what racism is and what forms it takes in our churches and in our communities. And then we hope to move people towards action, including but not limited to participation in the boycotts that are kicking off in December, which will be locally tailored or tailored on a state-by-state basis. And so folks who are watching this program now could Google Injustice Boycott to find out what's happening near them.
What I'm concerned about is that I think most people, when they listen to what you just said, will think, well, I'm not racist.
Right.
Or, well, what do they want?
Mm-hmm.
Or what's the big deal?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to really connect if you don't live in a Black community, or your neighbor isn't Black, or your wife or husband isn't Black, and you're not seeing what happens on a daily basis. It's hard to really understand why this is such a critical issue for our whole community. How do you make it personal to people?
In reading Drew Hart's book, he has a chapter in which he goes through several historical moments. And he says, when Africans were enslaved and were being oppressed and controlled by white USers, the Africans knew that it was wrong. They didn't think that that was right, what was happening to them. But the white community didn't, as a majority, didn't dispute it or try to overturn it. They said, well, it's right as far as we're concerned. He goes through several moments in history, coming up through the period of lynching in the United States, where African Americans were saying, what's happening to us is wrong. They're dragging us out of our beds at night. They're bringing trumped up charges and killing men, women, and children. The white community at the time, at least a lot of the white community, said, that's okay. There are many pictures that you can find that were actually promotional postcards that cities produced that showed dead bodies of African American men, women, and children with whites gathered around as if it were a picnic. And what Hart says is, we knew lynching was wrong, and the whites didn't. So we come up to today, and he says, with those examples that I've shared and a couple of others, And then he says, so today, African Americans are saying, we're treated unjustly. We're being shot at a higher level than white communities are. We're being frisked unjustly.
Imprisoned.
We're being imprisoned. Mass incarceration is affecting our communities, and this is wrong, and it's a problem. And the white community is saying, like it often has through time, we're not sure that's really a problem. Maybe the black community really deserves it, et cetera, et cetera. And Hart's point is, so far, the African American community, when it tells its own story, has been verified and validated in the sweep of history. And so far, the white community that said, well, we're gonna allow slavery to exist. We're going to not see lynching as a problem that we need to take drastic action to stop. The white community might be wrong again now. So let's bring it down to a church congregation. You and I are part of a church congregation.
We are.
In Portland, Oregon.
We are.
It is, in terms of regular attenders, 100% white people.
It is.
At least in terms of the way people represent themselves, if not their actual historic ethnicity. Now, I would guarantee you that there weren't people in the last 100 years of that congregation who intentionally said, let's have a congregation just for white people. But there are patterns and habits of who we're related to, either by blood or by relationship that we already have, that unless we make a choice to go against the grain, unless we say we're going to swim upstream instead of going with the river that society gives us, we're going to end up with what we've already had. Are there people who are actively racist and prejudiced against people of color? I don't think so. Well, why aren't we an integrated congregation? Because we haven't decided to go against the grain that society gave us to do something different. So, and I just give that not to hold up integrated church communities are the be all and end all, but to say there are many ways that the institutions that we inherit, that we didn't necessarily create ourselves, but have come to us as the legacy of the society that we live in, were constructed in a way that benefited white folks and didn't benefit or actively took resources from communities of color. So today we receive those institutions, and it's our choice whether to figure out how to dismantle those patterns or just to kind of let it be.
Matt Guynn, thank you for being with us on Brother and Voices.
Thank you. It's my honor.
It's our honor, too. For Brother and Voices, this is Brent Carlson.
And this is Matt Guynn. Wishing you peace.